Once we have our document set up, we want to set up our baseline grid as well. Baseline grid is what our body copy is going to adhere to throughout the magazine in order to maintain proper alignment and overall readability of that main content. So the baseline grid applies to the type settings, the typographic settings that we've predetermined for our body copy. I'm going to paste in a sample here that I have, and this is just from another article, and it's set at, the body copy is set at Minion Pro regular, and it's 10 point over 13 point. So it's 10 point type size over 13 point leading, which for this looks pretty good. And just a side note, if you want to get rid of the guide showing up for a moment while you're trying to look at other things, you can do Command or Control and your semicolon key, and that will turn the grids and guides on and off. So we know that we have a body copy setting here of 13 point. So we're going to go into our preferences, the InDesign preferences, and go to grids. And we'll set in the baseline grid section. So you may originally end up in general. You want to go down to grids and go to the baseline grid section. And we're going to set that to 13 point as well. So your predetermined body copy leading is what's going to determine what the increment is in your baseline. So we'll set that to 13. The color is fine, I'll leave it at that. I'm going to start it at a 1/2 inch. So it's going to start a 1/2 inch from the page edge. And then it's going to be a 1/2 inch, of course, relative to the page, the top of the page. You can also set that at 0 if you want, in terms of if you want to have folio items at the top and so on. That's maybe something that you want to play with as far as location goes. But I typically start mine at a 1/2 inch from the top of the page, 13 point increment, and then the view threshold is when we see it. So if we're zoomed in to 75% or closer, then we'll be able to actually see the baseline grid. It will come into view. If we're zoomed further out, it will disappear from view. And then grids in back. You want to keep that selected because if you are putting images down or any other content, sidebars and so on, you don't want it to be covered by the baseline grid. That is something, however, that you can come back and turn off if you have content maybe on top of an image or a background and you do want to see that baseline grid. For the most part though, as long as you know you're adhering your content to the baseline grid, you should be fine and be able to work around that. But this is something that I sometimes come back and switch just if I need an alternate view at how the type is landing on a certain image or background. So we'll say OK. And right now I'm zoomed in at 75%, so I'm just going to zoom in a little more and we don't see it. So that means my baseline grid is currently hidden. So we'll go to View and Grids and Guides, and I'll turn on Show Baseline. So that gives us a lot going on. We've got our columns, our rows, and now we have the baseline grid. So you can see it gets pretty busy. So again, zooming out beyond 75% hides the baseline. We can do that Command semicolon to hide the grids and guides, and then if we want, we can of course go back to View, Grids and Guides, and hide the baseline grid. To get our content, and we'll cover this a little more as we go through the magazine, to get our content to apply to that baseline grid, this actually looks like it's applied because of how I have it set into the columns and rows, but you can see it's not fully adhering. It starts off, but there's some spacing due to different type sizes and so on. So I'm going to double click into that content, select all, Command A. For now, this content would be played with a bit and different things done, but I'm just going to select all of it, go to my paragraph settings, and go over to Align to Baseline Grid. And that made a very slight adjustment. So overall, in fact, I think all of this content is the same size. So it just had one slight adjustment to the leading and it adhered to the baseline. So one thing you may want to do while you're working through this is have a reference for the gutters between the columns and the rows. I'm just going to hide the baseline for a moment so we can talk about that. And what we're seeing here is I'll make a little box here so we can see it. And that's not what I wanted to do. Here we go. I'll just give that a color that allows us to see it. So what we're seeing here is the gutters between columns. So that's 0.0667, a few millimeters. And then we have the same thing, the gutters between the rows. They'll be the same. So when we're working, when we're placing content and images, we want to remain on the inside of these gutters. We can of course cross columns and go down over rows, but we want to make sure that we're working within the inside. So this would be the outside edge. This is the outside edge of that gutter and the outside edge of the vertical gutter. So horizontal gutter, outside edge right here, vertical gutter, outside edge here. We want to work inside because these are to remain as that negative space, that dead space around our content. So in this case, if I had this text frame like this, it's currently on the insides here, but it's crossing over into that space there. And it's not doing it to do a full cross into another column. So I just want to move that back to the inside. So to make this a little easier as you get used to working with the columns and rows, what I like to do in tutorials is actually set up a gutter grid. So I'm just going to move this content over, and I'll actually do this in a spread. It makes it a little easier. And you can actually copy this if you need to from one page to the next, but I do find it useful, and I know new users often find this helpful. So I'm just going to, again, go to my shape tool and make a box that's properly aligned with that vertical or that horizontal gutter between rows, and I'll give it that fill of just the magenta, 100% magenta. And I'm going to copy this. So I'm going to use my Option, Shift, click and drag to copy these down. And I'm just going to Shift select a bunch so I can do it a little faster here. I'll select all of these, copy, paste, rotate. However you do this, fast or slow, doesn't really matter. I'm just trying to be as fast as possible here. And then I want to move these over because of course the gutters are different between rows and columns. So I'll get these located. So we're going 12 on the vertical and 12 on the horizontal of the page layout. So the gutters become get a little closer together on the vertical. Okay, so those are all placed, and I just want to make these a little longer, so I'll select these. Like I said, however you get to this point where it's clear for you is totally up to you, as long as you get them set correctly in those gutter spaces. And I'm going to select all of these and make a new layer, and I'll actually put this layer on top of the master page layer, and I'll just call it gutter highlights. And with them selected, I still have all those selected, I'm going to bring that down to about 15%, just so they're visible, and then I'll lock that layer. So I can turn those on and off if I want to. Actually, one thing I neglected to do there was actually move them to that layer. So remember to do that. I'll select them again. Right now they're on layer 1, and I'll just drag that box up to the gutter highlights. Now I can lock that. So if you do want to copy them from page to page or just move them along as you work through the document, you just unlock that layer and grab those and take them with you. But what this allows us to do is just have a better view of where those gutters are and how to work within them. And it really is just remembering that you're working on the inside of those gutters. So a good way to look at it is if you place something, an image or text frame, that they're framed by the gutter. That's why this highlight can be helpful as you get started, because you can see it's framed. If you have something like this, it may be framed on one side, or in this case 3 sides, but on this side it's not. So that's indicating that it's on the outside of that gutter. So I'll just move that frame in, and it's landing correctly